Thank you. In order to live longer, healthier, and more productive lives, we all should want a hyper performance, a high performance in the extreme drugs to patients system. Now, the goal of that system should be better drugs sooner at lower cost. And that goal is not being achieved. And that's because the FDA has a monopoly on access to new drugs. And in particular, the FDA continues to demand ever more extensive and expensive, both in time and money, clinical trial data. So the people who bear the ultimate cost from this dysfunctional system are the patients. So I'd like to briefly talk about the patients. On this slide, you'll see 11 pictures of cancer patients who were denied access to a not yet approved drug that their doctors thought had real, genuine potential to either extend their lives or even, in fact, save their lives. Now, the picture in the middle is of Abigail Burroughs. Abigail was the daughter of a very good friend of mine, Frank Burroughs. And she came down with cancer in her neck. Frank tried to get her into one trial and was refused because they said the cancer was in the wrong part of her body. He tried again for a second trial, and then they said she was too sick to enter the clinical trial. So after Abigail died, Frank decided to devote his life to dealing with this issue. So he founded the Abigail Alliance for Better Access to Developmental Drugs. Now, it's been 16 years since Frank started that organization. And oftentimes I hear the supporters of the status quo making the claim that something like free to choose medicine can't work because people and patients are just not smart enough to deal with these types of decisions. Now, in 16 years, the Abigail Alliance has fought for early access to 40 drugs, and they only have just some preliminary type of information. But of those 40 drugs, how many were subsequently approved by the FDA? All 40. So don't accept the argument that we're not smart enough to deal with our needed health treatments. Now, the third edition of the Free to Choose Medicine book is out there. And Vernon Smith, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, and partly for his work in deregulating markets, he wrote the foreword or the preface to the book. And he makes a very important point, saying that the Free to Choose Medicine system promotes decentralized responses close to the local knowledge that is available to physicians and their patients, but not to the FDA. This book is fundamentally bipartisan and should be read in that spirit. So the point is that the Free to Choose Medicine principles that we'll briefly discuss is economically sound. It's good stuff, and it's practical. Now, as to practicality, about 10 years ago, an early version of the Free to Choose Medicine was packaged into a booklet, and it was translated into Japanese by Mr. Yu, that's his short nickname, Mr. Yu, at the Japanese for Tax Reform, which is a free market think tank in Japan. And at that time, Mr. Yu indicated to me that he was going to give that booklet to every politician in Japan, including all the top management of the pharmaceutical companies in Japan. And I said, you know, great, have at it. Well, in 2014, Japan passed the equivalent of Free to Choose Medicine for regenerative medicine drugs, think stem cell treatments. And Heartland went back to Mr. Yu, and they've recently put out a policy paper on this, documenting what has happened in Japan and what was involved. And it turns out this thin little booklet actually had a very, very enormous impact over there, because Mr. Yu did what he told me in an email. I did what I said I was going to do. Now this is important because this is a major developed country that has now embraced the principles of free to choose medicine. And by the way, to no surprise, investment capital is flowing to Japan for regenerative medicine drugs. Now, there are three principles to free-to-choose medicine. The first fundamental principle is that it's competition to the FDA's status quo process. That after a drug has passed safety trials and one or more phase 2 trials demonstrating some initial efficacy, then a drug developer could put his drug on a free-to-choose track. Now, we're talking about having access to an innovative drug 5 to 7 years before what might become an official FDA approval. And a very important point is that the free-to-choose track would be operated independently of the FDA. An organization, perhaps the NIH, would be well suited. But since it's competition for the status quo, it needs to be operated independently of the FDA. So now individual patients could express their own preferences for risk, could talk to their doctor about their unique health condition, and then make a voluntary decision. Do they think an approved drug is in their best interest, or a not yet approved free-to-choose medicine drug? Now, we've talked about Japan as a significant demonstration in process of the practicality of free-to-choose medicine. Now, free-to-choose medicine is really common sense. So if it is common sense, outside the US, people should be moving in this direction. And there's a company in the Netherlands, it's called My Tomorrows, and I've met with the CEO, Dr. Ron Bruce. Very, very smart guy. Now, he was CEO of a biotech company that he sold to Johnson & Johnson for $2.5 billion. Smart guy. Now, his father came down with late-stage lung cancer, and as he tells the story, he said, there's a drug that a pharmaceutical company in Europe has that's clearly the best treatment for my father. I'm CEO of a biotech company. I should be able to get that drug for my father, right? Didn't work out that way. All the government bureaucracy involved and what have you. So after that experience, he formed this company, My Tomorrows. What My Tomorrows essentially does, it's a middleman. So if you're outside the US, say you have stage 2 pancreatic cancer, My Tomorrows will provide you the relevant information, just like free-to-choose medicine, so you can make an informed decision. And then My Tomorrows coordinates, it handles everything, the paperwork, dealing with the government, handling the drug developer, getting the right dosage, where do you go to get it administered? All of that gets done. This is working. It's actually taking place. Let me read to you a couple of quotes from Ron Bruce as to how he perceives the current situation. There is only one reason why a good drug is expensive: the 15 years taken to develop it. The molecule itself is not expensive. If we continue down the current route, the process will only become more expensive. But if we introduce drugs earlier to the first patient, they will become cheaper and more patients will benefit. Actors who benefit from the current system do not want change, but patients will ultimately win as they are the consumers. Society's growing access to data changes the world, and the pharma industry should not be the exception. Now, the second key principle is a trade-off evaluation drug database, or TED for short. Essentially, you and your doctor could get on the internet, it's an open access database, and all of the relevant information to make a comparison in terms of approved drugs versus not yet approved, free-to-choose track drugs would be there for you to make that call. The note on the slide that patients' genetic data and biomarkers would be part of the data. This is really, really critically important. Because as a drug is in developmental testing, as on the free-to-choose track, more and more patients will take the drug if the drug is giving good treatment results and the side effects are manageable. Now, we'll be able to isolate in real time, okay, in terms of biomarkers and genetic data, subsets of patients who do incredibly well. And that the drug developer his R&D will be facilitated to understand why. So it will be extremely advantageous if you're a patient to find out, are you a member of this subset of patients who is generating incredibly strong results? Now, with the current system, if a drug is in phase 3 and it misses its statistical milestone, but there's a subset of patients who do extraordinarily well, the FDA will say that's hindsight data, and go do another phase 3 clinical trial, raise 50, 100 million, and take 3 to 4 years. So what we're talking about here is just turbocharging innovation with fast learning. And the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, the innovation would accelerate by having access to this data, which would be displayed on TED. Now, the third component is observational approval. So free-to-choose medicine legislation would empower the FDA based on compelling data, observational data, not randomized controlled trial data, from the free-to-choose track, and that they could grant an observational approval. Now, that is a gigantic carrot to a small biotech company that has limited capital but extraordinarily high scientific skill. They can take their drug, and if they prove with free-to-choose results that their drug actually is better than the approved treatment available, then they could get observational approval. That would incentivize insurance companies in particular to reimburse for that drug. And it also would put pressure on the FDA if there's a drug out there that is doing incredibly well, and to get insurance reimbursement, all the FDA has to do is give it a nod and give it observational approval. That's a good deal. Okay, to summarize, the goal is to achieve better drugs sooner at a lower cost. We're talking about choice up, regulatory costs down, innovation up, competition for sure up, and drug prices down. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. Got one more slide I got to bring up, and Tim's going to come back up here and, with a few more remarks, and then we can open it up for questions.
Thank you. And the reforms we're proposing, free-to-choose medicine, are substantial. As I noted earlier about before the Bay of Pigs invasion, the current FDA was structured. That's how old the current system is. We probably all agree things have changed a lot in plenty of places. So you wonder, well, how can you make those changes? Is this even possible? A lot of time we come to conferences like this and say, hey, these are some great ideas, let's make some changes. How do we make it happen? And I'd like quickly show you how we believe free to choose medicine can happen and is already in the process of happening. As Mr. Madden has mentioned, based on some efforts of free to choose medicine nearly 10 years ago, free to choose medicine has debuted in Japan. We think the initial results are very promising. And you might ask, well, why did that start in Japan? Obviously, individuals make policy, and the efforts of the Heartland Institute and a one man in Japan trying to promote those changes. It's been implemented and is underway in Japan. But one thing to note about Japan, it's the single oldest society in the world. And regenerative therapies were not happening, and they needed a way to jumpstart innovation. So you have to have that happen, and that's why I believe one reason it did start in Japan, and hopefully the results will. I can certainly see a day they will have the type of regenerative therapies as stem cell treatment for Alzheimer's, which will be available in Japan and not here in America. We're actually starting to see that happen. The second round of reforming the FDA, which has already occurred, is right to try. We have mentioned that previously, signed into law by the President of the United States. I was there at the signing, and I came back and I was visiting with a few interns, or one intern at the Heartland Institute. There's one thing that really struck me that the President said. He said, what took so long? What took so long? Matt Bellina and thousands and others, the Goldwater Institute, Heartland, and dozens of folks trying to make these changes. What took so long? Again, the choice was before right to try that it was more important that Matt Bellina die so the FDA could have their way and wait. So 5 or 6 years, Mr. Bellina, you might find that treatment, or there might be a cure from the FDA, but that doesn't work for you. But the choice was before right to try, you should die if you have a terminal illness. Our thought now is after right to try, and we believe it has some fundamental flaws in terms of incentives for the marketplace, but we can take that kernel of truth. For the first time since 1961, at least with a terminal illness, you were able to access legally drugs. If you can find a company that would give them to you or sell them to you, you can access a drug if you're a terminal illness without the FDA approval. That is huge. That is a massive change. That's one component to free to choose medicine. But there are other rounds before we think we get to that. So we're looking as well as Mr. Madden mentioned, updating the database. Actually, the current commissioner of the FDA, Mr. Gottlieb, you might have heard him speak before at a conference like this. He's actually an intellectual ally that says we need to bring freedom and choice to the marketplace. And so we think there are opportunities working with the FDA, working outside the FDA to provide initial data. Actually, the key words the FDA is using today is observational data. Actually, in Japan, they have observational approval. They'll approve a drug for general use that hasn't been fully approved in Japan with the free to choose medicine process they're adopting over there. The fourth round we're looking at is targeting high-profile diseases, whether it be ALS, whether it be a particular type of cancers, or Alzheimer's. And if we can target those are things that the political realm says we've got to do something about. My mom is struggling with one of those diseases. The idea the FDA says, well, you know what? Maybe in 10 years, maybe in 10 years we might have a therapy. Maybe even 20 years we might have a cure. And we see those actually in the press regularly. Pharmaceutical companies say, hey, we've got great news. We've got a drug that made it through phase 1. And we're still 7 to 10 years out. And so targeting that politically, I think we have some things to do. We also have a number of federal agencies. I spent 6 years on the VA committee, and there are tremendous problems with the VA and tremendous specific diseases with veterans that they have not found solutions and cures for. And so we're going to be working. We think it's actually possible with Heartland Institute with Free to Choose Medicine actually showing progress by demonstrating to the politicians and to the bureaucrats as well as the industry that actually allowing individuals choice can actually show some solutions. And finally, our ultimate goal is congressional passage of free to choose medicine, which we believe will not help thousands of people, will not help tens of thousands of people. It will help millions of Americans, not those with just with a terminal illness, but with dozens and dozens of other things and illnesses and those afflictions. We think it's entirely possible, and I look forward to your questions about how we might implement that or thoughts you might have of how we change a system that's been stuck in the same method since 1961. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jim to handle questions for Mr. Madden and myself.